Hey, my name is Zhengli Qiang. Welcome to another video on the topic of the types of study design. And today we are going to introduce another types of study design about the cross-sectional study. A cross-sectional study is an observational study design that serves exposure and disease centers at a single point in time. And sometimes we will use the cross-sectional study to describe association. And we can use the cross-sectional study to get the prevalence of disease or health standards. Why we do cross-sectional study? The cross-sectional study will help us to assess the burden of disease in population and to assess the need for health service. And will help us to compare the prevalence of disease in different populations. And it's to examine trends in disease prevalence or severity over time, and it will help us to find out some associations sometimes. How to design the cross-sectional study? First, you have to define the population, then drive a sample from the population. And in every study, you have to define the characteristics being studied. Every variable have to be a clear definition. These are characteristics of a cross-sectional study. Exposure and disease outcomes are determined simultaneously and provide a snapshot view and has measured the prevalence, not the incidence of the disease. And cross-sectional study will know the existence of disease but not the duration, and often used to study conditions that are relatively frequent with long duration of expression. And it is not, you have to remember that the cross-sectional study is not suitable for studying rare or high fatal disease or a disease with short duration of expression. And the cross-sectional study will help us to examine effects on physiological variables such as blood pressure and lung function. These are advantages of cross-sectional study. And first is the cross-sectional study may study several outcomes. And another is to control over selection of subjects and control over measurements and relatively short duration. And the cross-sectional study is the first step for cohort study. And the cross-sectional study will give us the prevalence of a disease or health standards. These are disadvantages of cross-sectional study. The cross-sectional study does not establish cost-effect ratio and may be potential bias in measuring exposure, and there have potential survival bias, and it is not feasible for rare disease and does not yield incidence. This is an example of cross-sectional study about the COVID-19 patients with digestive symptoms in China. Ecological study, it is easy to establish links between environmental exposures and health outcomes using individual level light. And ecological study design provides another way of avoiding these difficulties and studying the effects of environmental and exposures on different health outcomes. And the ecological studies look for association between the occurrence of disease and exposure to known or suspected causes. However, and you'll remember, the unit of analysis is not an individual, but a population or a group of persons. Ecological studies are useful for generating hypotheses. This is an example of ecological study that is stock volatility, the association between the stock volatility and the chronic heart disease deaths in Shanghai, which has been published in European Heart Journal. This is longitudinal study. Longitudinal study is based on multiple observations in the same population over a prolonged period of time. Then it repeats the cross-sectional study for many times. And we use the longitudinal study can help us to get to get the natural history of disease and to identify risk factors and to find out incidence. This example of longitudinal study, that is Baglossi heart study. Baglossi heart study is the purpose of Baglossi heart study is to explore the trajectory and life course of metabolic risk factors and the clinical outcomes. And it is a famous longitudinal study and has now been followed up for more than 40 years since 1973. These are major references. Thanks for listening.